we finished chapter 13, which is good. That's the conclusion of the previous section of Matthew's Gospel, which was Matthew's presentation of the kingdom of heaven. And we saw that in Jesus' explicit teaching and in the parables that he told there. And today we begin chapter 14, which begins a new section, the identity of Jesus. Matthew he's been proving that Jesus is the Messiah this whole time. That's like the point of Matthew's gospel, to prove to Jews that Jesus is the Jewish Messiah. Today he starts talking about the identity of Jesus, and this section runs all the way through chapter 17, verse 27. So 3 chapters here, 14, 15, 16, 17, 4 chapters here. And then the 2 sections following this, we've only got 3 sections left in Matthew's gospel, so we can feel glad about this. We can feel happy about this, that we only have 3 sections left in Matthew's gospel. But that goes all the way to chapter 28, verse 20, the last verse. After the identity of Jesus, we'll talk about what the disciples' place is, what our place is in all of this. And then after that, the work of Jesus. I should put there the finished work of Jesus, because really that's what Matthew is getting at. Like, this is the work of the Messiah, the work that the Messiah is doing. And he concludes with Jesus being given all authority and then giving us our mission, the Great Commission. As we move through the text today, I want to keep these 2 questions in mind. Why are there so many opinions about who Jesus is? And question number 2, what is the best way to know about Jesus, who Jesus is? So, Matthew chapter 14, verses 1 through 12. If somebody would please volunteer and read all 12 verses. Yeah. All right, so there's some messed up stuff going on here.
Oh, yeah.
But we will...
Some dance.
Yes, there must have been a dance.
All right.
He was
We'll
flicking her hair, but you know.
we'll walk through this passage like we normally walk through a passage. We'll see it in 3 parts here. Verses 1 and 2, we'll see that Herod hears about Jesus. Verses 3 through 11, we'll see why Herod misidentifies Jesus, saying that, this Jesus guy that I'm hearing about now must be the resurrected John the Baptist. So he misidentifies Jesus. We'll see why he does that in verses 3 through 11. And then in verse 12, we'll just see something about John's disciples and their knowledge about who Christ is. Verses 1 and 2, Herod hears about Jesus. At that time, Herod the Tetrarch heard the news about Jesus. At what time did Herod the Tetrarch hear the news about Jesus? While Jesus was preaching and doing miracles in Galilee, particularly here as he was leaving Nazareth. At that time, Herod heard the news about Jesus. And he said to his servants, "This is John the Baptist. He has risen from the dead, and that is why miraculous powers are at work in him." Herod who's ruling now, hears news about Jesus and says to his servants, "This is John the Baptist," indicating he hadn't heard about Jesus before John the Baptist's death, right? This is when he hears about Jesus, is after John the Baptist is beheaded. This is John the Baptist, and he has risen from the dead, and that is why miraculous powers are at work within him. Why does this Herod believe that miraculous powers are at work within Jesus? Why must it be that John the Baptist rose from the dead, is being called Jesus, and that is why miraculous powers are at work within him? Like, why would this be Herod's statement? Why would he be thinking this way? But yeah, miraculous powers are at work in him because this is somebody who died, and now he's back from the dead again, and he's practicing these miraculous powers, almost like, oops, I made a mistake, and I'm going to speculate here that this Herod is a little bit fearful because, all of a sudden, here's this guy, people are saying he's a prophet, and he has these miraculous powers. This is John the Baptist, and of course this is speculation, the text doesn't say this. He's back to get me because I killed a prophet. No, that may not be what's going on here. The text doesn't give us that information, but that's kind of how I read the text. So we'll look at verses 3 through 11 now. For when Herod had John arrested, now this is the flashback. So it's like, okay, we know that John the Baptist is dead, and we get to that point in the text like, wait, when did that happen, right? What happened? Flashback. Now Matthew's going to tell us. Verse 3. For when Herod had John arrested, he bound him, put him in prison, because of Herodias, the wife of his brother Philip. For John had been saying to him, it is not lawful for you to have her. John the Baptist, he was speaking the law here. Exodus chapter 20, verse 17, that's one of the 10 commandments. Thou shalt not covet your neighbor's wife. So there's that one in general. Don't covet your neighbor's wife. Leviticus 18:16 and Leviticus 20:21, there's a specific command there. Do not unclothe your brother's wife.
Oh boy.
And John, he addresses the problem. Of course, Herod is this political figure, ruler, and John the Baptist, he's basically critiquing the morality of this guy. Like, this guy is morally flawed. And, John the Baptist says that. What do you expect? Criticizing a king. Now, Herod wanted to kill him, but was afraid of the people, right? Although Herod wanted to put him to death, here it is in verse 5, he feared the crowd because they regarded John as a prophet. And John, it was indeed a prophet, right? We see this in chapter 11, verse 9 of Matthew's gospel. Jesus taught that John the Baptist was a prophet. John the Baptist is the second Elijah, and that's what his identity is, and his role to play in the whole gospel narrative. Verse 6, but when Herod's birthday came, the daughter of Herodias danced before them and pleased Herod, so much that he promised with an oath to give her whatever she asked.
She sure set that one up, didn't she?
Man, obviously Herodias knew Herod's desires there, and I don't know if there are sexual connotations intended here, but it sure does seem a little bit like there is. I don't know. Maybe I'm imagining things or not, but it seems to be Herod's character. He sees his brother's wife. Oh, I want her. I'm going to take her for myself. And now his brother's daughter that he had with the wife he stole is like pleasing him with the dance, and he's like, I really love that dance. What do you want, girl? Like, what can I give you, girl? And so he promised to give her anything that she asked. Verse 8, having been prompted by her mother, so Herodias is working all this together, having been prompted by her mother, she said, give me here on a platter the head of John the Baptist. Although he was grieved, the king commanded it to be given because of his oaths and because of his dinner guests. He sent and had John beheaded in the prison. And his head was brought on a platter and given to the girl, and she brought it to her mother. And so you see why Herod is kind of like paranoid about maybe John coming back to life. Here's this prophet. The people regarded him as a prophet. You don't kill God's prophets, but he did. And so I imagine that he's imagining the possible consequences. Oh, all of a sudden I'm hearing about this guy named Jesus. He's doing some powerful, miraculous things. He has these mighty powers. What's in store for me now? And then verse 12, John's disciples. John's disciples came and took away the body and buried it. And they went and reported to Jesus. Did this Herod know really who Jesus was?
Probably
No,
not.
I don't think so.
He said, that's John the Baptist. Jesus was not John the Baptist.
He did his own world.
But John's disciples know who Jesus is. Right? What have John's disciples learned about who Jesus is?
John told him. John's disciple. Oh yeah. What now? Say again.
John told him.
Yeah. We've seen it in Matthew's Gospel. There was a point in Matthew's Gospel. This is in Matthew chapter 11, the first 6 verses. And we'll read it together again just to remind ourselves of what was going on there. But John's in prison. Apparently Herod, this Herod put him in prison. And John's in prison, and he sends his disciples to ask Jesus what question? Are you really the guy? And Jesus answers them. Jesus told John's disciples who he was. This is in Matthew chapter 11, verses 1 through 6. When Jesus had finished giving instructions to his 12 disciples, he departed from there to teach and preach in their cities. Now when John, while imprisoned, heard of the works of Christ, he sent word by his disciples and said to him, "Are you the expected one, or shall we look for someone else?" Jesus answered and said to them, "Go and report to John what you hear and see. The blind receive sight, and the lame walk, and the lepers are cleansed, and the deaf hear, and the dead are raised up, and the poor have the gospel preached to them, and blessed is he who does not take offense at me." Jesus here, quoting from Isaiah chapters 35 and 61. And so he's telling them, look, you see the prophet Isaiah being fulfilled before your eyes. The blind see, the deaf hear, I'm raising the dead to life, the gospel is being preached to the poor. Restoring justice to the earth. That's what the Messiah is going to do. And he's saying, you are seeing this. Go and tell John the Baptist what you've seen. Of course I'm the expected Messiah that was foretold in the Old Testament. So here's Herod saying, that's John the Baptist. That's the prophet. And that's not who Jesus is. And then John's disciples who go and report John's death to Jesus, they know who Jesus is, the Messiah, the expected one, the one who heals disease, the one who restores sight to the blind, the one who raises the dead to life, the one who preaches the gospel to those trapped in their poverty, to those who are poor, the one who is restoring justice to the world and taking the iniquities of his people on himself. That's who Jesus is. And so here in Matthew's gospel, just at the beginning of this section in Matthew's gospel, Matthew is already drawing a distinction between who Jesus is not and who Jesus is. How many opinions are there? To say with Herod, say we'll take what Herod is saying here, and to say that's John the Baptist resurrected. It's to identify Jesus as, well, it's not to identify Jesus as the Messiah, but how is that identifying Jesus? Like, what are the characteristics?
As a prophet.
A prophet. Okay, he's a prophet.
Right.
How else do people identify Jesus? I've heard a prophet. He was a great teacher. Jesus was a really good man, a really good moral example for us. What else do we hear about Jesus from people or from other religious points of view? What about Muslims? Like, what do Muslims believe about Jesus?
He was just a man.
A prophet.
A
A prophet, a teacher. He was one of God's prophets.
Yep. It's even in the Quran that way.
But not Messiah. God does not. Well, actually, the Quran does call Jesus Messiah. He said he was a prophet and Messiah, but he was not the Son of God. And it's very emphatic about that. And he did not die on a cross because God's prophet doesn't die. He's brought up to heaven, right? So he did not die. So he was not resurrected. And God does not need a son because God alone is God. And that's what the Quran says. That's what Muslims. Yeah. What about Hindus? What do Hindus think about Jesus?
I would just guess that they probably think he's one of the billion gods that are available.
Oh, another god. Great, let's add him. Yeah, that's pretty much what happens. Unless a Hindu's really convicted, and then they're like denouncing all their other gods. And sure. What about Jehovah's Witnesses, Mormons? What do they say about who Christ is?
He was a god.
A god, so that would be Jehovah's Witnesses, and was a god.
Brother to Satan, Mormons.
Mm-hmm. Brother to Satan. A good example to follow for the Mormon Church, right? We follow Jesus' example, and just like Jesus, we can, and they don't use the language of self-actualization, but that's what it is. We can self-actualize, and we all get to become kings of our own little planets like Jesus did.
I never could figure out why that made sense to anybody.
Yeah. So a lot of stuff being said about Jesus and who Jesus is. And here, Matthew just comes out from the start. No, Jesus is not merely a good teacher. No, Jesus is not merely a prophet. He is a prophet. He is a good teacher, but not merely that. No, Jesus is not merely a good moral example. He is our moral example. He's not merely our moral example. He is not John the Baptist. Jesus is not the new Elijah like is prophesied in Malachi chapter 4 verses 5 and 6. He's not that. Not a mere prophet, not a mere teacher, not a mere moral example. Jesus is the expected Messiah, like prophesied in Isaiah chapter 35 verses 4 and 5 and Isaiah chapter 61 verses 1 and 2. He is the one who actually really does this, really heals his people, who really takes his people's infirmities, who really raises the dead back to life, who really is restoring justice to the world. And we will see how Jesus fulfills all this. Remember, we're in the section about Jesus' identity right now. And we will see when we get to the work of Jesus, the final section of Matthew's Gospel, how Jesus is carrying out all of these prophecies. But right now, it's identity. Jesus is the one the Old Testament foretells. What is the best way to know about Jesus? Diane, you held up your Bible. And and here Matthew is, Matthew for 13 chapters now has been presenting evidence after evidence after evidence that, this guy's the Messiah. And then we get to chapter 14 and Matthew is finally like, all right, let me tell you about my Jesus and who he is.